restrictions alter growth in our state. My name is Talmadge Heflin. I'm the director of the Center for Fiscal Policy at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Thank you for being here today. And I would hope that the answer to that would be yes. Will budget restrictions alter growth in our state? Well, why do you have budget restrictions if you're not expecting it to have some alteration factor to the budget? Why have limits at all in the law or in the Constitution? The legislative body can enforce limits on what their budget is on any given session. They can, with the limit that we have today, one that is adopted based on what a group of economists say the growth of personal income will be for the next 2 years. The legislature, even after that number is adopted, they don't have to appropriate up to that. Now, there's procedures that they have to go through if they want to go over that number. But so why have limits at all? And I think the key to that, the question is, the answer to that question is, so that you have some uniformity from session to session. I think it's important so that that guideline is there so that they know that they may decide, as was decided, announced, I don't know, a couple of sessions ago. I think at the time the growth number was adopted, the lieutenant governor said something publicly, something to the effect, in fact, I think he may have even put it in writing, but we're not going to go over population and inflation. That's not what the limit was that they adopted. So the legislature, even though they have guidelines and limits, they don't have to go up to that amount. So, but without anything, you would have the uncertainty of, okay, what will they adopt? What will this group adopt? Well, we're going to talk about that today. We've got some folks here that know a great deal about budgets and limits, and we'll hear what we actually have in place today and how it works, and then have a discussion about, what might work better. Might have a little history about what is done in other states and what is effective there. But the key is that we need to keep in mind that the taxpayer is not a cash register that has unlimited funds. The taxpayer needs to be considered because their ability to pay the bill is something that is very important for the long-term economic health of the state. So we're going to start out this morning by hearing a little bit about what goes on today. And we have Ursula Parks, who is the director of the Texas Legislative Budget Board. We refer to it as the LBB. Ms. Parks has been on the staff of LBB since 1993. During her tenure, she's worked in various capacities, including budget analyst, budget team manager, assistant director, agencies, and the agency's deputy director, has been directly involved with the development of budget policy recommendations for a number of the state agencies and institutions within all state government functions. But she has spent much of her time dealing with public education finance. She has a bachelor's degree from the American University, and she will tell us about how it works today and whatever insight that she has. Welcome, if you will, Ursula Parks.
I was going to say, I don't think Talmadge wanted me to have his phone up here.
That's my time.
So good morning, everybody. I'm happy to be with you today to talk about spending limits. Like Talmadge said, I'm going to cover the various constitutional limits on state spending, and in particular the basic mechanics of the Article 8 limit that is referred to as the spending limit, as well as some conceptual discussion of the conversations that have happened around revising that limit. The topic today is limits or no limits. Will budget restrictions alter growth in our state? In my opinion, yes, constitutional limits on spending do affect budget growth, but I also think it's really important to understand how those limits work and what they really do affect and what they don't affect, and take the conversation from there. So the Texas Constitution actually contains 4 limitations on state spending. We commonly talk about just 2 of them, but there really are 4. The first 2 are focused on certain types of spending. And the second 2, which are the 2 that most everybody talks about, really don't concern themselves with the purpose of the appropriations that are made. They have a much broader application. I will note that the 1617 state budget is within all of those stated limits. The first one that I will touch on just briefly is the constitutional debt limit, commonly referred to as the CDL. And this limits the amount of debt service that might be paid from general revenue. And the state is within that limit. As you can see that the provision states that the amount payable from unrestricted GR can't exceed 5% of those funds for the previous 3 years. And the state is well within that limit, and it was adopted in 1997. The second that I will make brief reference to is the welfare spending limit. This one was adopted into the Constitution in 1945. The welfare spending limit is applied to cash assistance only. The language about assistance grants in the Constitution really limits that provision to grants of funds made out. It actually acts as an exception to a general restriction in the Constitution against making cash payments to individuals. The Constitution does also provide an exception if this limitation would somehow violate federal requirements. I will note that the base of this provision, as it says, is the entire state budget. The 1617 all-funds budget for Texas was about $209 billion. So that would yield a welfare spending limit of about $2.1 billion. We only spend about $100 million in TANF appropriations, so we are well within this particular limit. The first of the big 2 limits that we generally speak of is the pay-as-you-go limit. This is the limit that is in Article 3 of the Constitution, and this is the limit that essentially prevents the state of Texas from deficit spending. This limit says you can't spend more than is estimated to come in the biennial revenue estimate. It's the oldest of the limits from 1942, and I think it's not difficult to imagine all of the various political and economic and social pressures and changes that were coming into effect at that time that yielded passage of this amendment. I will note briefly which appropriations are limited by the pay-as-you-go limit. And I'll also note that while the LBB, as Talmadge said, does track both appropriations and revenues, and we track this limit is really completely in the purview of the state controller. When we talk about this limit, what we're really talking about are general revenues that are estimated to come into the Treasury, plus GR and general revenue dedicated balances. At the very bottom of the slide is something that I'd like to point out. The funds listed at the very bottom, that last set of bullets there, are classified as other funds in the state budget, so they are not general revenue. They are therefore not subject to the pay-as-you-go limit. So these include things like the Economic Stabilization Fund, the State Highway Fund, the Mobility Fund, and the Property Tax Relief Fund. All of these funds have quite significant revenues in them, and there can be significant appropriations made, but they are not subject to the Article 3 constitutional limit. The limit that we talk about as being the spending limit is in Article 8, Section 22 of the Constitution, and you can see the language, the relevant language is there, and I've bolded what we consider to be the really key portion of it. It was adopted in 1978, and it was adopted as part of a larger package of amendments that were offered to voters in response to what amounted to a taxpayer revolt at the time. Taxpayers were coming forward and saying, my ability to pay into the Treasury is not keeping up with the legislature's ability to pay out of it. So again, very much as Talmadge referenced a moment ago. For that reason, it was very specifically designed to focus on state tax revenue. So these broadly applicable state taxes that were affecting most taxpayers in the state. So it was really specifically designed as a way to address that taxpayer ability to pay into the Treasury, and also is specifically linked to the estimated rate of growth in the state economy. So the Constitution really provides that the limit be based on an estimated, that is to say projected, rate of growth in the economy. I'll note that in 1978, Texas was doing very well economically. Personal income for the previous few years had ranged up to almost 16%. Consumer inflation was around 7%. And the state of Texas had very strong job growth, particularly in comparison to the rest of the country. So for those of you who have been keeping up with how Texas has performed relative to the rest of the nation in recent years, the dynamics were very similar as were in place in 1978 relative to the Texas economy, relative to the rest of the nation. I will note as well that in that package of amendments that in which this was adopted, there was also a homestead exemption that was offered to the voters, which was adopted. The agricultural valuation exemption that is still in place was adopted as part of that package. And there were also a variety of truth in taxation and some property tax administration provisions that were put in place. So I think it's important, to understand that this provision was part of a broader package of amendments that really more broadly addressed taxation and how that is calculated overall. There's a second part to the spending limit that is statutory. The Constitution delegates to statute the ability for the legislature to make certain determinations about how the spending limit operates. So while the Constitution demands that the limit be based on the estimated rate of growth in the state economy, it is statute that defines that as personal income. I will note here as well that the 16-17 budget retains about $2 billion in capacity under the spending limit that was adopted a little over a year ago. So one of the questions that often comes up with respect to the spending limit is exactly what does it control? Does it control everything? Does it control a portion of the budget? Does it control certain kinds of spending? Does it control certain kinds of revenue? So the first thing that I'd point out is that the spending limit only cares about how revenue is generated. The spending limit does not care where that revenue is deposited in the Treasury, nor does it care about how that revenue is expended. It really only cares about whether or not it is state tax revenue, not dedicated by the Constitution. There is a very common misconception that the spending limit applies solely and exclusively to general revenue, and that is not the case. A couple of examples that I can offer on that is that lottery proceeds are general revenue in the Treasury. The lottery, however, is not state tax revenue, so it is therefore not subject to the spending limit. The available school fund is general revenue, but the revenue stream associated with it is constitutionally dedicated, and therefore it is not subject to the limit. The state highway fund is not subject to the spending limit. However, the Economic Stabilization Fund, as I noted earlier, is not general revenue. It is other funds, but its revenue stream is undedicated state tax revenue, and therefore it is subject to the spending limit. There was some discussion during the 84th legislature that really had to do with this particular question. It had to do with the relationship of the spending limit and the pay-as-you-go limit to the successful efforts that were underway at the time to reduce revenue, to enact some tax cuts, to do a homestead exemption, and to reduce the franchise tax. And there was a fair amount of discussion around what that relationship would be. So I would just note that, and I would note that both of them do have a relationship to both of these limits. With respect to the homestead exemption, that one can be particularly non-intuitive. It is a local revenue source that the state of Texas was, at the state level, was choosing to reduce. So one wonders why that would be subject in any way to a state constitutional spending limit. The point there is that the state, as a result of those lower property taxes, had to spend more money to make up that lost local revenue in order to make the school district entitlements whole. That's the way the school finance system works. So the state had to spend more money, and therefore that expenditure of undedicated state tax revenue and GR was subject to the limit. As I noted a moment ago, the Legislative Budget Board does adopt the spending limit, and this is one of those times when I'd like to make clear that when we talk about LBB in this context, I mean the actual board of the LBB. I do not mean the staff of the LBB. I try to be clear about that as often as possible. So there's an actual board meeting. Our board meets to adopt the spending limit, and they are required to do so before the session. So the last adoption happened on December 1st of 2014, and that's the limit that was operative for this last legislative session. The basic mechanics of the calculation is looking at the amount of appropriations from revenues subject to the limit, the rate of growth that our board adopts is applied, and that product is the new limit. What I will also note here is that the limits that are brought forward are ones that are solicited from a variety of economic forecasting houses. We solicit those estimates, we get them from those folks, and we bring them forward to the board for their selection. They make a determination about which to adopt. It is very common for the adoption to be the one that is brought forward by the controller. That is not uncommon. That is often also the lowest of the rates of growth in personal income that are provided, which is also typical, that the lowest one be the measure that is adopted. Another question that we very commonly get is whether or not the limit changes. The answer to that is that the adopted rate of growth does not change once the board adopts it. That amount remains static. So whatever they adopt, that remains in place. What can change is the amount and mix of revenue that supports appropriations. So the revenue can change, but the rate of growth does not. As a result, the final relationship of spending relative to the limit can change. I would note that it's only in recent years that we've been in a pretty unusual situation of having the amount of capacity that we've got under the pay-as-you-go limit and under the spending limit have been very close. That is not common. It is much more typical for the pay-as-you-go limit to be the controlling limit, and it usually ends up being the controlling limit after the subsequent supplemental appropriations are taken into account. I would note an example of this was that at the end of the 83rd session, we were left with less than $700 million under the pay-as-you-go limit and less than $800 million under the spending limit. This is a good time to remind everyone that that spending limit remains in effect for the subsequent supplemental appropriations. So the legislature, and again, I think Talmadge made this point, almost always leaves room under the spending limit, in part because you've got to fit supplemental appropriations under that same threshold next time. So although we left session with this $700 to $800 million roughly amount between the pay-as-you-go and the spending limit, that's the amount we were under. After changes happened to what 15 balances really looked like, we were actually $8.3 billion under the pay-as-you-go limit, but still only had less than $600 million in spending limit capacity. We are also regularly asked whether or not the limit can be exceeded, and the answer to that is yes. The Constitution provides that the limit may be exceeded by a simple majority vote under certain specified criteria. I would note here, though, that has only happened once. So the legislature has only once voted to exceed the limit, and as noted in the slide, that happened in 2007. The legislature passed Concurrent Resolution 20, and that was entirely in response to a need to accommodate $14.2 billion in increased state spending associated with property tax relief measures that were enacted that session. So for that very particular purpose, the legislature voted to exceed the limit. That is the only time since its creation that has taken place. There are a variety of proposals and discussions that happen around shifting the spending limit. And the legislature certainly entertained some of those. Some of those would change the constitutional provision. As you can imagine, that's a little higher threshold for the legislature to clear than passing a change to the statutory provision. So a change, for example, shifting from personal income to some other estimated rate of growth in the state economy would be a statutory change, or another possibility would be adding an additional limit, something that would act in concert with the existing constitutional spending limit that is in place. So the kinds of things that could be tweaked around kind of roll down to these three basic things. The rate, the measure of economic growth, the base, so what spending is subject to the limit, shifting it perhaps from state tax revenue not dedicated by the Constitution, or having a supplemental limit instead of changing that one that would apply maybe to all funds in the state budget, or all non-federal funds in the state budget, or all general revenue in the state budget, would be other ways to further bracket what the legislature was able to do in their spending. And the third piece is perspective to retrospective. So right now, as the Constitution says, it's an estimated rate of growth in the state economy. And so that would be a projection going forward of what the economy is estimated to do. There's been discussion of making that retrospective instead, so looking at what had happened in the past. The only thing that I would note there, just one of the things to bear in mind with that, is that as we stay under the amounts that are estimated in the biennial revenue estimate, that is a projected amount going forward of the total amount of revenue available. So we would be in a situation there where we might have one limit that was prospective and one retrospective. But those are sort of the main things that could tweak it. The only other thing that I would add to that is that there certainly has been a fair amount of discussion around changing the limit, and I think that those discussions are good and they're healthy, and they are fruitful to have. And I do think that it's important to have that really measured and robust discussion around it. It is a complicated issue, and unintended consequences could be quite significant. And really making sure that all of the limits that we've got in place and all of the provisions that we have in place make sense as a body of work, I think is a critical thing to just work through as we have this discussion. So with that concludes the remarks that I have. I will be happy to turn it over. I think Dr. Poulson is next. Yeah? All right, thank you.
Thank you. Well, sometimes it's good not to just look at what we've been doing, what our statute says, what our Constitution says, but what's happening in other states, and what are some different ways of having a limit. What's the effect of those? And to discuss some of those things, we have Dr. Barry Poulson, Emeritus Professor of Economics at the University of Colorado. He's been a visiting professor at several universities and the author of numerous books and articles in the fields of economic development and economic history. Served on the Colorado Tax Commission and is vice chair of the state's Treasury Advisory Group on Constitutional Amendments in Colorado. Past president of the North American Economics and Finance Association, an advisor to the Task Force on Tax and Fiscal Policy of the American Legislative Exchange Council, and serves as a consultant on fiscal policy and fiscal constitutions to a number of state and national think tanks. I've had the pleasure of knowing and working with Dr. Poulson for a number of years, and I'm looking forward to his comments today. Welcome, if you will, Dr. Barry Poulson.
Thank you, Talmadge, and thank you for inviting me and getting me out of the snow in Colorado. The only problem is that my wife is back there shoveling snow, and I'll have hell to pay when I go back, but it's good to be here. I helped design Colorado's Tabor Amendment and the tax and spending limits introduced in a number of states, and working with legislators, including here in Texas. We've been at this for almost 4 decades, and so we've learned a lot. So my purpose is to talk about why tax and spending limits work in some states, why they don't work in some states, including Texas, and how we might improve the tax and spending limit here in Texas. We have the origin of tax and spending limits goes clear back to California in the early 1970s when then Governor Reagan and Milton Friedman traveled the state supporting Prop 1, the first state tax and spending limit, which would have reduced state spending as a share of state income. While that proposition failed narrowly, it set the precedent for tax and spending limits in California and subsequently in 32 states. So later in the 70s, we had Prop 13, the property tax amendment, and also the Gann Amendment in California, which was the first state tax and spending limit linked to inflation and population growth. Over the years, new tax and spending limits were introduced, and I helped work on our Tabor Amendment in Colorado in 1992, which is regarded as, in many states, as the most effective tax and spending limit that we've introduced. And let me talk a little bit about Tabor and why I think it's so effective. Tabor has both direct limits on revenue and spending and also procedural limits. The direct limits limit the growth of spending in Colorado to inflation and population growth. And it applies that limit to total spending. And whenever the state hits that limit, surplus revenue must be rebated to taxpayers. Tabor also has procedural limits. It sets a supermajority vote for the legislature to spend surplus revenue, and most importantly, it requires voter approval for any new tax, any issue of debt, or any increase in tax, or increase in debt, or expenditure of surplus revenue. It was introduced in 1992. It was triggered in 1997. At that point, Colorado rebated $3.25 billion in surplus revenue to taxpayers. And after several years of tax rebates, then Governor Owens decided the appropriate thing was to cut taxes. We cut the income tax, the sales tax, the business personal property tax. We created one of the lowest tax burden states in the country, and we had the second highest rate of economic growth in the country in the late 1980s. We were growing more rapidly than Texas at that point. When Colorado hit the recession in 2001, we were hit hard. We had a 19% reduction in state revenues. And it revealed two flaws in Tabor. One is what's called the ratchet down effect. When that revenue fell 19%, that set the base for the Tabor limit, and of course that ratcheted down spending for the next few years. It also revealed a flaw in our limit because we have no rainy day fund in Colorado. In 2005, we corrected one of these flaws. We changed the limit. We had a Tabor timeout for 5 years, and we changed the limit so that the limit is applied to the previous limit, not to the previous revenue, so we don't ratchet it down anymore. Colorado has yet to introduce a rainy day fund. So we've learned what works and what doesn't work. One of the most important provisions in Tabor is this voting requirement. The state in Colorado has proposed dozens of tax increases. Only 2 of those have passed since 1992. 2 modest tobacco tax increases. The state has proposed spending surplus revenue numerous times. Only twice have Colorado citizens voted to spend that surplus revenue, in 2005, and then most recently last year when they voted to allow the state to spend some surplus marijuana revenue. The state has proposed new debt 3 times, and the voters have turned it down every time. The procedural limits, in some ways, are more important than the direct limits on revenue and spending. So, we've learned a lot about what works. Let's talk about what doesn't work, and that's the Texas tell. You have a tax and spending limit that has really been very ineffective in constraining the growth of revenue and spending in this state. And so let's talk about what I think are the fatal flaws in Texas's tax and spending limit. First of all, linking the tell limit to personal income. It's too volatile. When your personal income is fluctuating as much as it does, in Texas, you can see what happens. It allows revenue and spending to grow too rapidly in some years, and then that sets you up for a shortfall in other years, and then there's a tendency for legislators to find ways to circumvent or suspend the TEL limit. So you want to link the TEL limit to inflation and population growth. The second flaw in Texas is linking the limit to projected income. It's very difficult. Economists do the terrible job of forecasting. We can't forecast anything. And especially in Texas, forecasting personal income out 3-4 years is very, very difficult to do. It's much better to base your TEL on historical trends in inflation and population growth, not try to base it on some projected income. I think the most important flaw in Texas's TEL is most of the expenditures is exempt from the limit. Less than 50% of total state spending is subject to your limit. In fact, this is basically what made California's TEL completely worthless. In the late 80s, they did the same thing. They exempted most spending, and since then, the rest is history. California has allowed spending to increase very rapidly. They've incurred debt. They've never had an effective spending limit since the late 80s. Shifting expenditures off budget, funded by fees and other sources of revenue. When you have these dedicated funds that are kept in separate funds and then allocated separately from your main budget, this creates too much room for obfuscation. I don't care what you call it, but it's very difficult to control revenue and spending when you have these things off budget. Texas has an emergency fund and a budget stabilization fund, so in that sense your TEL is superior to our Tabor amendment. But we find, looking at the historical record, these funds have not been used the way they should be used, especially your budget stabilization fund. Essentially, that money should be available for the years you have revenue shortfalls, and it should be used to back up your tax revenues so you can maintain stable growth in spending. Historically, that is not how your budget stabilization fund has been used. And finally, I think we found in our research that these procedural limits are extremely important. What you have is a majority vote requirement. The legislature with a majority vote can basically do whatever it wants to do. That's a recipe for disaster. You need a supermajority vote in the legislature to spend surplus revenue, to make changes. What this does is it gives you a much more deliberative process. And legislators are going to have to compromise and reach some consensus to get some change in your tax policy, your revenue policy, your spending policy. A supermajority vote could be extremely important in achieving that outcome. I think that having voters approve new taxes and debt and spending a surplus revenue is extremely important in Colorado. I know that's a difficult task in Texas because you don't have initiative and referendum, and so, but it is something to consider. So based on this, what do we recommend? How would we design a better TEL for Texas? One, we think that you should design a new tax and spending limit which is linked to inflation and population growth or some multiple thereof. This would give you a much more stable growth of revenue and spending than your current limit, which is bouncing around based on personal income growth. We think you should have a very clearly defined emergency fund, budget stabilization fund, and a capital investment fund. And basically what should happen then is as you generate surplus, the surplus spills over to your emergency fund, it spills over to your budget stabilization fund, and then that money is there whenever you hit a recession. You can boost your spending to make sure that you're maintaining that growth of spending at inflation and population growth. Whenever you're generating surplus and you have adequate emergency and budget stabilization funds, you should be using some of that surplus or offsetting some of that with tax rebates or better yet tax cuts. And I'll talk in a moment about at least some preliminary work that my colleague and I have done, which suggests that with this type of tax and spending limit in place, you can eliminate the franchise tax, one of the most damaging taxes any state has introduced. You can completely eliminate it if you have an effective tax and spending limit of the type that we're designing here. You should have a supermajority vote requirement for the legislature to tinker with your revenue and spending. You shouldn't rely on just a majority vote. My colleague John Merrifield and I have, over the last few years, designed a dynamic simulation model. And we have applied that in a number of states, including some preliminary estimates for Texas. And what this dynamic simulation does is it takes this model TEL and it asks this question: what if back in 1992 a state such as Texas had introduced this type of tax and spending limit and applied it over these 2 decades? What would your fiscal policies look like? And how would that compare to your actual fiscal policies? And then we do some sensitivity analysis to figure out how sensitive this model is to our parameter assumptions. And let me just show you a couple of examples of states where we've applied this and how important this type of tax and spending limit can be. The first state here, I guess, let's see, that would help. That's it. Go back to California. California is a disaster state. I always like to start out with California. If you can go back to that one. There we go. On the right-hand graph there, this is how actual revenue and spending, actual spending compares to simulated spending. The top line, of course, being the actual growth of spending in California. And what you can see is 2 things there. This is one of the most profligate states in the country. They've allowed spending to increase much more rapidly than inflation and population growth. And notice the volatility in spending. They rely very heavily on the income tax. So you get this very rapid growth of spending during the growth years. And then you have the sharp contraction of spending in the recession. Note that with this type of tax and spending limit, you would have a stable growth in spending, and then you would in fact have an increase in spending during the recession, a counter-cyclical increase in spending, and then a return to this long-term path. And I always like to point out, to use California, because with this type of spending limit in place, California could have significantly reduced its income tax. It could have cut the income tax rate in half, which is, by the way, what we did in Colorado. And what our simulation model captures is the effect on growth. This is called dynamic scoring, and there are 2 things that happen that stimulate growth. When you reduce the amount of resources going to the public sector and increase it going to the private sector, you promote growth. If you reduce the marginal tax rate, you promote growth. So what the simulation model measures is the possible potential reduction in income taxes with this in place. Well, if you cut the income tax rate in half, you can be sure you promote a lot of economic growth. In fact, on the left-hand side of that graph, you'll see that the simulated growth by the end of that period is income is 7% higher than actual. That may not sound a lot, but that means a substantial boost in household income in California with this type of effective tax and spending limit in place. The next graph shows Montana, and there you'll see that, again, this is another sort of profligate state, not quite as bad as California, but they see the very sharp increase in spending in those growth years and then the very sharp contraction of spending when the recession hit. Notice what this TEL would do. It would maintain a more stable growth of spending and then stabilize spending during the recession years. Montana is an interesting state because they have no sales tax. We simulate in this model, with this type of tax and spending limit in place, they could eliminate the income tax. I repeat, they could eliminate the income tax with a modest boost in their sales tax, with just a few percent sales tax. Now that, believe me, and this is what we're simulating here, could create a huge boost in economic growth in Montana. At the end of that period, the left-hand graph shows that income would be about 5% higher with this tell in place than actual income. The last graph, we wanted to look at a conservative state. This is Utah, and notice that in Utah they haven't experienced quite the profligacy of California and Montana, but they do have a lot of volatility in their spending. And notice that, again, in the case of Utah, what this tell does is maintain a stable growth, including a stable level of spending during the recession. Notice that Utah is a pretty conservative state. They haven't, there's only a modest potential for a modest reduction in their income tax there. And so there, you don't get the boost in spending, boost in income there that you would in these other states that we looked at, about a 1%. 1% is not peanuts. By the end of this period, the 1% improvement in income is an important outcome. But more importantly is the stability in spending that's created with this tell in place. Now we think that Texas is a little bit more like Utah. Texas is not California. And Texas is probably a little closer to Utah in terms of this outcome. Our preliminary results, simulations for Texas, suggest that you would get this kind of boost in income, but more importantly, with this in place, you'd get a more stable growth of spending, and you could eliminate the franchise tax. I think that would be probably the single most important thing the legislature in Texas should do right now. Get rid of that very, very negative effect of your franchise tax. I'm getting a sign that says time. My time must be up. Let me just add that something that I think people don't quite place enough emphasis on. When you have an effective tax and spending limit in place, it strengthens the democratic process. And believe me, people have been trying to get rid of the Tabor Amendment for 2 decades, and our approval rates now are more than 70% citizen approval of Tabor. Citizens in Colorado have been voting on these issues now for 2 decades at the state level, at the local level. I served on our tax commission in Colorado, and we held hearings around the state. I love the hearings we held in Weld County. Weld County is Colorado's Texas. We produce as much oil and natural gas in Weld County as all the other counties in Colorado. They pursue even more prudent fiscal policies there than the Tabor, than that imposed by the Tabor Amendment. And in those hearings, these citizens would testify, believe me, their perception, especially at the local level, is government's too big, it's too expensive, and it's too intrusive in their lives, and they want this type of constraint on government revenue and spending. So I encourage you to take a serious challenge to introduce a more effective tax and spending limit.
Thank you, Dr. Poulson. Well, we've heard kind of what our structure is for the spending limit that we have, how it's applied, heard a little something about what's happening in other states and suggestions for Texas. Now we'll look at the realm of possibilities, because our next speaker is a voting member of the legislature. He can actually make these changes, whatever changes he wants on his own. Well, maybe not on his own, but he can impact them. We have with us Senator Kelly Hancock, first elected to the Texas Senate in 2012. He represents Senate District 9, which includes a portion of Tarrant and Dallas counties. Previously served 3 terms in the Texas House of Representatives. He's on numerous organizations, including the Conservative Coalition, the National Coalition for Capital, and the Texas Conservative Roundtable have acknowledged Senator Hancock for his efforts in promoting fiscal responsibility and conservative values, a graduate of Baylor University with a degree in business. If you will, please welcome Senator Kelly Hancock.
Well, that sounds all well and good, and y'all need to know before, just to be transparent, I have asked my wife and my daughter to be here because I am the only one on the panel that has 2 daughters getting married. And with a wedding in February and one in May, I'm probably the last person in the room that needs to be speaking on spending limits, because I've tried that and it doesn't appear to be working within our own household. It may be easier to pass it legislatively than it is to make that take place. Actually, we are a very conservative household, and there were spending limits even on those, and both of my girls are doing well within that. So kudos to them, and kudos to my wife, who actually is a banker's daughter, so she understands spending limits on doing that. I do appreciate the opportunity to be here. And the Senate was able to pass a change in the spending limits on doing that. But before I get started, I have to ask, so you've heard a definition and an outline on what our existing spending limits on, and how many lobbyists do we have in here? All right, so y'all aren't going to be honest. The rest of you, honestly tell me, you completely understand our spending limit now and what that applies to and what it doesn't. If you do, please raise your hand. All right. We had one, and I understand that when you're basically running Senate Finance, you tend to have to understand those. That is a little bit of the issue, is it not? Shouldn't spending limits be about the people and not about the politicians? You see, the spending limit is good for me because I can go home and say we passed a budget within the spending limit. But in true reality, the spending limit should be good for my constituents. We should not have a spending limit that is politically based. It should be a spending limit that is practically based and based on sound fiscal policy. I also believe it should be a spending limit that's not so restrictive and restraining that we don't address our needs within the state. The legislation that was passed out of the Senate this year, although initially the numbers that we got for that piece of legislation showed that we could not adopt a budget meeting our needs and addressing our needs and meet the population and inflation numbers. But yet, when we passed it out of committee and we passed that final appropriation bill, the state, in fact, I will say that when I went home this session, I had more compliments on what this session accomplished. Not just from the social standpoint, not just from a political standpoint, from a financial standpoint on what we addressed and how we addressed it. In other words, how we appropriated funds appropriately, and we did it within the spending limit of population inflation, and we left money in the bank. Are you going to do this? You want me to do it? I'm guessing. Oh, okay. It's upside down. I got it now. Forward means forward now. Upside down, it meant backwards. We got it. The current spending, and I'm not going to, first couple of slides are things that you've already sat through, and I'm not going to sit through them again because you sat through them once and you didn't get it. So I'm not going to go through it again so that you don't get it again. But I do want to point out a couple of things. When we have underlined in this slide that the limit is calculated by estimating the growth of the state's personal income of current biennium. See, as an elected official, I don't believe that we should determine what we're going to spend based on what we can take. Right? Based on, we should not, thank goodness, and see, this is very practical, and I'm glad my family's here. We should not determine what we're going to spend on a wedding just because it may have been a good year. Can I get an amen? Amen. Thank you very much. But that's kind of what we do, isn't it? When we look at these numbers. And the other thing that we do under this limit is you look at it, it's a simple majority. That's already come up as well. Now, we can look back historically and say, well, that's only occurred, this time or that time. But the reality is a simple majority is a simple majority, and any piece of legislation can pass with what? A simple majority. Are not fiscal matters a little bit more important than average legislation? I tend to think they are. That threshold needs to be changed. It needs to be moved. So the practice that takes place today, the Legislative Budget Board, they meet in the fall, and they come out with these numbers. There's, Ursula, right, 5 different numbers, statistics we number, and they're all kind of projected numbers. So we're projecting numbers, right? Anybody know what happens when you do projected numbers? There's deviations in projected numbers. You ever known anybody, the best economists in the world, could not project an economic numbers? We cannot project the future accurately 100% of the time. But what we can do is we can look at historical numbers and we can know factual, accurately, quantitatively, analytically, exactly what those numbers were because they've already occurred. In Senate Bill 9, which we'll show in a little bit, it shows that we asked to go to the Federal Reserve in Dallas, which gives you regional numbers to look at. We wanted hard numbers. Combine those hard numbers with what we've done in the past, the growth we've seen in the past, along with projected numbers in the future, mesh those two together so that you're not restrained with what's happened in the past, but you're also not committing based on projections for the future. When these numbers were presented in 2014, the numbers were 11.68%. Some of the key issues in the current limit, the spending limit only applies to less than half the government. It's about 45% of the government. And if you've got an hour and a half and a sheet of paper, Ursula and I can sit up here and we can show you what exactly that means and how we get to that number. But the reality is when you have a political spending limit, all you need to know is it's called a spending limit, and I can go home and say we passed a budget within the spending limit. And that works well for me because I'm an elected official, and it sounds really good. But is it very practical? I happen to think it's not as practical as we need to have in the state of Texas in order to protect us for the future. It's also, as we talked about, based on personal income. Personal income is going to vary. We do need more consistency. That's why you would mesh historical numbers with projected numbers in order to get you a meshing so that you're not committed one way or the other, but you kind of have this smoother pathway into future growth. It relies very, very heavily on projected. I do think that we need some analytical numbers. Are they perfect numbers? Absolutely not. Could those, on LBB argue that, well, we can't use those because those aren't, they really don't pertain, past numbers really don't pertain to what's coming in the future. Well, isn't that one reason we study history? History tends to repeat itself. If we've learned anything in the state of Texas, history repeats itself. In other words, though we've had 7 years of an economic boom due to oil and gas, any of us that lived in the state very long knew that wasn't going to last forever. I think, if anything, this last session shows us where we're at today, shows us why we don't want to simply build a budget based on projections. Anybody want to guess where we projected oil and gas would be for this next biennium? $65 a barrel. We've already adjusted that once. There's a chance we're going to adjust that again. We're building a budget based on speculative data. We need to incorporate in that hard data, realistic data. And I don't think it's wrong to go to history because history tends to repeat itself, and history is a pretty good gauge for where we're going to go in the future. I think the appetite's right. We did pass it for the first time out of the Senate, a more restrictive piece of legislation dealing with spending limits. There are other proposals out there. There's a proposal out there that my good friend and colleague, Chairman Otto, he wanted to come up with these target numbers for every article within our budget. I don't know how good your math is, and I'm kind of a simple math guy and a common sense guy, but the more numbers that I have that are speculative, that may have a variance or may have deviations, and then I multiply those together, the more numbers that I'm multiplying with even small deviations, when you multiply those together, your deviation does not shrink, it increases. We don't need to make the spending limit in the state of Texas more complicated. We need to make it simpler so that those people that are footing the bill can understand what a spending limit is. And frankly, so that at least half the people in the legislature, which would be a marked improvement, can go home to their constituents and tell them what a spending limit is and what it is, and you don't have to hire an accountant to come in and explain the state spending limit. This kind of gives you a little projection. Here's numbers from the past legislative sessions. It's population and inflation. The little dot you see, 11.68, that actually should go near the end. That was the number that we came up with on the spending limit. Nearly a 12%. Now, maybe you had a 12% pay increase in 2 years. Even if you did, kudos to you. I don't think just because you did, we should take it. And we should spend it just because we took it. Gives you a good chart, kind of shows you where the numbers are. Again, I want to point out in 2016, even though initially when we filed the bill, we were told that, essentially you looked at it and the numbers we initially got, I didn't think we could get a budget within that number. Because anytime we buy down local property taxes, we have to pay for it as a state. And so with what we were trying to do on providing some tax relief, that was costing our budget. I know that doesn't make sense either, but it does. It was costing our budget. In order to do the tax relief that we want to do, I wasn't sure what we could do with the budget and address our transportation needs, increase funding for education, which we did, increase funding for transportation, which we did, increase funding for health and human services, which we did, and we still stayed below population and inflation. We still stayed below the numbers that are available for LBB to choose from with population and inflation. It's doable. Those that argued that it wasn't doable or didn't want to vote for the bill because it wasn't doable, it is doable, and we did it. And in fact, we did it, and I went home and heard more praise for this legislative session's budget than I'd ever heard before. It can be done. The reality is, from a political standpoint, it's more difficult. It's so much more easy to just spend money than it is to prioritize spending of money. Sometimes you have to say, you don't get the invitations with the curled ends. You can have all the curly cues you want on the invitation, but the curled end invitations just cost too much if you're going to spend that much on flowers. I'm just giving you some practical realities. I'm going to run through a couple of this because I know we're short on time, and I want to make sure that I finish on time so we can take questions. The number, SB 9, it shows you there on the bottom kind of the rates that we fell within, and if we'd have gone back and applied those. What we're not talking about in SB 9, we were not talking about giving a one number and saying, here's the number, you've got to hit this number, you've got to be there. But the delta that we have currently in our spending limit is a very, very large delta between the lowest of the 5 numbers to the highest of the 5 numbers based on speculative data. What we want to do is kind of shrink that number and still provide some flexibility and limitations. When you break it down into funding of the articles, here's kind of what happened in the articles. One of the reasons that you wouldn't want to provide target numbers for every article is, let me ask you a question. You see a couple of reds in there? If you provided funding targets, how many of you think that you would see any reds when you say, here's what you can spend if you want to spend it? Probably not very likely, but yet you had to reduce some in order to prioritize and put it into other elements. You look there in some of the other elements. General government is a very, 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 very small portion of the budget. Basically, half your budget is, almost 80% of your budget is Article 2, Article 3 in there. And so just so you see the percentages growth, but you need to know how big that pie gets. But that's kind of what happened here with an end result of 5.8, well within the limits that we were recommending with SB 9. So at the end of the day, I think we have found kind of a sweet spot, or very close, with the bill that passed out of the Senate last session. I do look forward to working with the House, and I want to give them some kudos and shout-outs when we talk about dedicated funds and how you can play with the budget with dedicated funds. The House has been the lead on cleaning up dedicated funds and getting rid of that so that we are pushing some numbers in there. They've done Speaker Strauss has done a phenomenal job really in targeting that and addressing that where we can and still be within that spending limit. And so where they're focusing on one area that I think is very, very beneficial to the state from a fiscal policy standpoint. The Senate's, we're looking at another one. I assure you this bill will be filed again, and we'll be working with our colleagues to see that we get something passed. I do think it is very important for the long-term fiscal policy of the state that we get a practical and not a political spending limit. Thank y'all very much.
Thank you, Senator. Well, there you have it. Do you have any questions? I believe we've got a mic. If you would wait on it to get around, if I could see the hands of any question, we have time for a couple. Anyone have any questions? Right, we'll have one right down here.
Is there any chance that Texas will be able to vote on proposed tax increases?
You want me to answer?
Sure.
Sure.
You'd introduce it.
Yeah, I'd probably introduce it. I don't know that I could get it passed. You know, one of the things, the difference, you know, in passing legislation, and that's even to take something to the voters, a constitutional spending limit, which I filed and I'd love to have passed, it's got to pass the legislature with a 2/3 vote, and that's not going to happen. Just to be, I'd love for it to happen, but politically, it's, you know, we couldn't get a simple majority on both chambers last time on we couldn't make a legislative change. So to take it to the voters, it would be a constitutional change, which takes a 2/3 vote, and then the governor signing it. And I would say not at this time.
And I might add that Texas, for the citizens to vote on something like that, the legislature would have to send it to them. We're not an initiative state. In other words, the citizens can't initiate a proposition like you hear in a number of states, California being the one you hear most often, but Texas is not one. So, but you know, I think it brings the question up, makes it the comments that were made about the difference between a majority vote and a 2/3. Senator Hancock just pointed out how difficult it is to get that 2/3. So there is merit in going to a 2/3 rather than a simple majority. Other questions? Yes, Ramon, right here. If you would, yeah.
My question is, you said the oil at $65, was that in regards to the budgets? It's at 32 today, that's less than 50%. How much does oil affect the state budget?
Yeah, that it does not like it did in the 80s because we're a much more diverse state. I mean, you know, Governor Perry, the past legislatures that were there before me deserve a lot of credit. We're a much more diverse state than we used to be. I think Ursula would. And so the impact, the other thing that happens for a period of time, and it's not happened as positively as we'd like, when households spend less on gas, they typically go spend that money elsewhere, which means our sales taxes increases. The other good thing is we stayed below population inflation. In other words, we did legislatively what I believe we should do with a new spending limit, which meant we left money in the Treasury, which means when our revenues drop, we're still able to meet our appropriations because there's money that we didn't spend. Now that's dwindling. You know, all those numbers, economic stabilization funds dwindling, Treasury, what's left in the Treasury is dwindling. All that's going to dwindle because the economy is slowing down significantly. So, but because of the budget we passed and the people that you sent to Austin, actually with this budget, I think we'll be fine. Now, next session, we'll get new numbers.
Yeah, I wouldn't add a whole lot to that. I think that's right. You know, the controller did say in the fall that there would be less revenue than was projected, you know, back in the spring, and a lot of that is oil and gas driven. And yeah, the price is certainly much lower than what was projected. I will say production, however, is still high. in the state. And as the senator said, we've got a much more diverse economy in the state than we did the last time we had a real oil and gas related recession. So yes, everything is slowing down. Everything is more sluggish than it was, coming in, and we certainly will not have the kind of balances going into next session that we did going into the last, which was a significant, had a real buoying effect, on the discussion that happened, and those balances just won't be in place next time.
But I do think, the example I use is, that's why you don't want a spending limit purely based on speculative numbers.
Well, we've come to the time to close now. We hope that you will join us next door for lunch to hear about education freedom. But if you would, please help me thank the panel for their fine job this morning.